Hello and welcome back to episode 5 of Grave Humanity Podcast. I know I'm a day late, but change was not going to happen overnight, so I'm just happy that I am releasing an episode this week. We are in California this week, but before we begin, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my very first Patreon, Jordan. Thank you for the subscribe. I also wanted to let you guys know that Patreon is free. You don't have to pay anything extra. You just have to make an account. I'm gonna do hopefully the first 50 episodes of Patreon for free, and then I'll figure out the tier system as we get more into it and more involved. So if that's what you're hesitant about, Patreon is free. You don't have to pay anything. Just sign in and subscribe to my page, and then you'll get bonus episodes weekly. So, just throwing that out there. So, with that being said, let's do the damn thing. This week, like I said, we are going to be in California, and I have two stories for you guys this week. One of them, I think I'm going to leave a little unfinished, and we'll finish it up on the Patreon because there was just so much that I started going down rabbit holes, and it would have been a very long episode, and I was getting overwhelmed, so I'm going to cut it off kind of early, and then we'll dive more into like the theories of everything that happened, and that's going to be our last story of today's episode. But first, we are focusing on Marcus Wesson. Marcus was born in Kansas on August 22nd, 1946. His parents were Benjamin and Carrie Wesson, and he had 3 younger siblings. He was raised originally as a Seventh-day Adventist, and Marcus considered his mother, Carrie, kind of a religious fanatic, if you will. Marcus's father, Benjamin, was an alcoholic and abused his children, then eventually walked out of his family. By 1960s, Marcus and his family moved to San Bernardino, California. Marcus dropped out of high school and joined the Army from 1966 to 1968 as an ambulance driver. After Marcus got out of the military, he moved in with Rosemary Solorio and her 8 kids, and she was quite a bit older than Marcus was. In 1971, Rosemary gave birth to a son with Marcus. In 1974, Marcus began sexually abusing Rosemary's 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. Marcus and Elizabeth eventually got married when Elizabeth turned 14, and I'm getting a couple different ages of how old Marcus was at the time. A couple sites said he was 34, and a couple other sites said he was 27. Either way, huge and disgusting age gap right there. 4 months after they got married, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child. Marcus and Elizabeth ended up having 10 kids total, with 1 infant who eventually passed away. Along with their own 10 kids, Elizabeth's younger sister left her 7 kids with Marcus and Rosemary. She told them that she could no longer watch them due to her drug addiction, and so she just dropped them off at the house and said see ya, basically. Marcus never really could hold a steady job and lived primarily off welfare, as well as his children, who were old enough to work, and he made them give him all their earnings. In 1989, Marcus was convicted of welfare fraud. Due to his employment status, or lack thereof, he and his family would find shelter in boats, vacant homes, or ran-down shacks. Like his father, Marcus was abusive towards his wife and all his kids, which included his nieces and nephews. Marcus would not allow Elizabeth to help with their kids' upbringing, and he homeschooled his kids and taught from his very own handwritten Bible that was about Jesus Christ being a vampire. And I tried finding like a manuscript for this book, and I could not find it anywhere, but the gist of it was Jesus was a vampire. So he taught his kids that he was God and that he would only be referred to as Master or Lord, and that they had to prepare for the end of times depicted in Revelations. He told his daughters they were to be his future wives, and that's what they were pretty much born and raised for. Marcus's education for his daughters consisted of teaching them oral sex at ages 8 and 9. The girls' household duties consisted of washing Marcus's dreads and scratching his armpits and head. They weren't allowed to talk to any of their brothers or their own mother. Marcus not only physically abused his daughters, but his sons as well. Marcus raped 2 of his daughters and 3 of his nieces, all starting at 8 years old, all eventually becoming pregnant with his kids. Around March 12, 2004, Wesson mentioned his intentions to move his family, meaning the daughters and their children, to Washington, where Marcus's parents were currently living. On March 12, 2004, multiple extended family members, including 2 of his nieces who rebelled of his upbringing, came to his family's compound demanding the release of their kids. The police were called to the site, which was described as a custody standoff. Marcus told police to wait at the door, retreated back into the house, and once he had returned to the door, his clothes were filled with blood. Fresno police said they never heard any gunshots, although witnesses who were there at the custody standoff said that they heard multiple gunshots. So I'm kind of unsure about who heard what. Police then discovered that 9 bodies were in a bedroom filled with old coffins. All 9 of the victims were shot through the eye, and thankfully not all of his kids and nieces and nephews were at home at the time, so they were able to survive the horrific incident. The victims, and I'm gonna just read off the names, and you'll see how fucked up Marcus was. Sabrina April Wesson was 25 years of age, and she was his daughter. Elizabeth Brahai Kino Wesson was 17, also his daughter. Illabelle Carey Wesson, 8, was his daughter as well as his granddaughter. Aviv Dominic Wesson, 7, was his daughter as well as his grandniece. Jonathan St. Charles Wesson was 7, was his son as well as his grandnephew. Ethan St. Laurent Wesson was 4, and he was his son as well as his grandnephew. Marshy St. Christopher Wesson was 1, and he was his son as well as his grandson. Jeva St. Vladimir Wesson was 1, as well as his daughter and granddaughter. Sedona Vadra Wesson was 1, and she was his daughter as well as his grandniece. Marcus was represented by public defenders, and they brought to defend his case, saying that his 25-year-old daughter Sabrina committed the murders, then committed suicide. The .22 handgun was in fact found with her body, and her DNA was all over the gun. The jury didn't actually think that Marcus pulled the trigger, but convicted him of murder because they thought that he forced his kids into a murder-suicide pact, basically brainwashing them. He was sentenced to death on June 27, 2005, with 9 counts of first-degree murder, and he is being currently held in San Quentin State Prison. During the investigation, several of Marcus's sons, came forward defending him, saying he was an amazing father who loved all his kids and would never hurt them. Goes to show how insane brainwashing can really take over someone's mind if they're raised in that kind of household and that's all they grew up to know. On to the next. The Black Dahlia. Elizabeth Short was born in Boston, Massachusetts on July 29, 1924. Her parents, Cleo Alvin Short Jr. and Phoebe May Sawyer, had 5 daughters total. Virginia May West was born in 1920. Dorothy Schlosser was born in 1922. Elizabeth was born in 1924. Elnora Chalmers was born in 1925, and Muriel was born in 1929. Cleo was enlisted in the Navy while Phoebe was a housewife. When Cleo got out of the Navy, he started building miniature golf courses until the stock market crash of 1929, where he lost most of his savings. In 1930, they found Cleo's abandoned car on the Charlestown Bridge, where it was assumed that he had jumped into the river. Phoebe assumed that her husband and the father of her kids was gone and started working as a bookkeeper. Elizabeth, at the age of 15, had lung surgery due to being sick with bronchitis and having severe asthma attacks. Doctors suggested she move to a milder climate to hopefully prevent potential future respiratory problems. She ended up being sent to live with family friends for the winter in Miami, Florida for the next 3 years. Elizabeth eventually dropped out of high school during her sophomore year. And in 1942, 12 years after the assumed death of Cleo, Phoebe received an apology letter which revealed that Cleo was in fact not dead, but that he was living a brand new life in California. Elizabeth moved to California December 1942 at the age of 18 to go live with her father, whom she had not seen since the age of 6. Arguments between Elizabeth and her father, Cleo, led to her moving out in January in 1943, just about 2 months total living together. Elizabeth took a job at the base exchange at the then Camp Cookie, now Vandenberg Space Force Base, where she briefly lived with a U.S. Army Air Force sergeant who abused her. She left the area in mid-1943 and moved to Santa Barbara, where she was arrested on September 23, 1943, for drinking at a bar underage. Juvenile authorities sent her back to Massachusetts, but she ended up going to Florida instead, and only occasionally visiting family in Boston. Elizabeth met Major Matthew Michael Gordon, Jr., a decorated Army Air Force officer of the 2nd Air Command Group, who was actively training for a deployment to Southeast Asia during World War II. While Major Gordon was recovering in India from a plane crash, Elizabeth had said that he wrote to her proposing a marriage. She said yes, but he unfortunately died in a second plane crash on August 10, 1945. Elizabeth's sister, Dorothy, also served in the military, decoding Japanese messages. Now, I was a little curious about Major Matthew Michael Gordon, so I Googled his name, and I'm just going to put a little snippet of what I found about him. He did go into in World War II. He was a P-40 fighter pilot for the Flying Tigers. He eventually named his P-40 the Nipponese Nemesis, eventually became an ace, victorious over 5 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. February 25th, 1944, Major Gordon crashed while piloting an L-5B Sentinel reconnaissance plane, which they used to call a flying jeep, and he was looking for a downed pilot at that time when he himself went down. Once back in the fight, Major Gordon received the Silver Star for his gallantry piloting against enemies in aerial combat in China-Burma-India Theater of Operations during World War II. August 10th, 1945, Major Gordon was killed while piloting a P-51 Mustang near India, just weeks before Japan's surrender on September 2nd, 1945. He was only 26. I also tried finding more information about Elizabeth's sister Dorothy and her line of work, but I unfortunately could not find too much on what she did in World War II. Now, back to the story. July 1946, Elizabeth moved to Los Angeles to visit Army Air Force Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling, who was in the Navy Reserves, who was on the Naval Reserve Air Force Base on Long Beach. January 9th, 1947, Elizabeth had just returned home from a short trip to San Diego with Robert Red Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman who she had been dating. Red told police that he dropped Elizabeth off at the Baltimore Hotel in downtown LA, where she was supposedly meeting one of her sisters who was coming to visit from Boston. Some staff remember seeing Elizabeth using the phone in the hotel lobby, while some people at the cocktail lounge about a quarter of the mile from the hotel remember seeing her there. On January 15th, 1947, Elizabeth's naked body was found in a vacant lot. She had been cut into 2 pieces, right at the waistline. Her blood had drained out and her skin was a shocking white. Medical examiners said that she had been dead for about 10 hours before her body was found, around late January 14th, early January 15th. Her body had been washed and the corners of her mouth had been sliced to her ears, almost like a Joker style. She also had cuts on her breasts and thighs, and there were also pieces of her flesh that had been cut away. Elizabeth's lower half was positioned a foot away from her upper half, and her intestines were tucked underneath her butt. She was posed with her hands over her head with elbows bent 90-degree angles, and her legs were spread apart. At the crime scene near the body, detectives found a heel print amongst tire tracks. There was also a cement bag containing bloody water. During the autopsy, they found marks on her ankles, wrists, and neck, as well as her right breast was sliced and parts were missing. There was also cuts on her right forearm, left upper arm, and lower left side of her chest. Her body was cut completely in half, but examination showed that it happened after she was already dead. There was another deep cut from her belly button down about 4.5 inches. Along with the cuts on her face, she also had bruises on the front and right side of her head. Her skull was not fractured, but she was bleeding internally, bleeding which indicated that she had been hit on the head. The cause of death was considered to be hemorrhaging from all her injuries to her face and her skull. There was also signs of potential rape. They were able to identify her due to her fingerprints in the system from her underage drinking arrest. On January 21st, 1947, a person claiming to be Elizabeth's killer called the editor-in-chief of the Examiner, saying they were doing amazing coverage on the event and that he'll turn himself in eventually, and that they were expecting a souvenir in the mail. On January 24th, a suspicious manila envelope was found. There was a message from cut letters from magazines and newspapers. There was also written on the front saying inside contained possessions of Elizabeth. Her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, names written on pieces of paper, as well as an address book with Mark Hansen embossed on the cover. The manila envelope had been cleaned with gasoline, but they were able to pull partial prints, but it was compromised in transit. On March 14th, a potential suicide note was found written in paper and pencil, tucked in a shoe with a pile of men's clothing by the edge of the ocean. It reads, "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in. So this is the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that or this. Sorry, Mary." By spring of 1947, the case had gone completely cold. Now, this is where the rabbit hole kind of starts. There are multiple suspects and theories of who did this, what happened, why this happened, and there's just so many to list that I started getting very overwhelmed when I was doing the research. So I am going to end the Black Dahlia here for this episode, but for the Patreon episode, we're going to kind of dive into those theories and potential murderers during that time and who police investigated and what they found. And I know this is a little bit of a shorter episode. I am still trying to get back on schedule, so the next few episodes will be a little shorter than I was hoping for, but we are going to get there eventually. And just kind of a reminder, if you guys do have any ideas of what you would like to see, not necessarily stories, but something maybe I could do every episode to make it more interesting, or if you have any ideas, please let me know. I've been trying to figure out what exactly I want to do extra, like a little tidbit in the episodes, and I'm drawing blanks at this point. But I hope you liked today's episode. And going back to earlier, Patreon is free. Just need to sign up if you want extra episodes. This week's is coming out on Friday. That one should be on time. And I will see you, if not, back here on streaming platforms. And I hope you guys have a great week. Bye.